Hi, and thanks for clicking on the video. Today what I'm going to be going over is actually installing the Spot Hogg edge swap rest on my bow for the first time. Now, I don't have all of the gear with me that I usually do when I do this sort of thing, so I don't have the bow vise and the spirit level and all of that because I left it at the archery club. But I'm going to try and experiment and see if I can figure out a quick and dirty way of getting myself pretty close with my installation. So this is probably not going to be your conventional how to install a blade rest style video, but it's either going to work or it's not. We're either going to learn something or we're going to have a bit of a laugh. So without further ado, I'll set the camera up so it's looking at the bow and hopefully we can figure this out. So the first thing that I need to do when I take the existing rest off of the bow and put the new rest on is make sure that the rest mounting bar is level on the bow. And I'm going to try something that I haven't done before, quick and dirty way of doing it. And what I'm going to do is use a pencil to draw a line on the riser along the top of the mounting bar, which will then be my guide for making sure that the new mounting bar is put on the bow straight and level. Obviously afterwards, once all of this is done, I'll make sure to put it in a bow vise and use the level like I have in a previous video that I'll leave a link to in the description box below. But I don't have that with me at the moment, so for the intent of getting this installed today, this is what I'm going to try. So I've got the pencil and I'll draw the line above the rest like that. So now is the part that I have not been looking forward to, and that's actually taking this rest off of the bow, considering the fact that at the moment the bow is shooting really well. So there's no point in prolonging the inevitable. We'll grab our Allen keys and take this rest off. Alright, there we go. Basically from here, I'm starting from scratch. So the next question is, short mounting block or long mounting block? I'm going to use the short one for now. So what I also then need is the mounting screw and washer, which I've got here. And now I guess what I need to do is try and make sure that I line the top of the mounting block up with the pencil line that I drew on the riser as best as I can. Alright, so that looks pretty straight to me. As I said, I will actually double check this with the level and everything when I have access to the bow vise. So the next thing that I have to do is obviously attach the first block to the bow. Now this one is the one that's been engraved with the O for outdoor, because that's what I'm going to be setting the bow up for initially. And then once I'm happy with that setup, I'll put the other one on and set up my fat arrows for that one. Alright, so there we go. New rest is attached to the bow. Looks pretty good. What I now need to do though is adjust the blade angle, because to me that angle there, it's hard to see because of the black on the black, but the angle looks a little too steep, and I want to start with about a 30-degree angle. Right, so before I get carried away and I actually mount this to the bow, I thought I'd have one more quick look at the instructions. And basically what I noticed, being secondhand, this has been mucked around with obviously, in this little sight window here, I'm supposed to be seeing half of it as spring and half of it as solid metal. And then I'll know that my micro adjustable travel for the blade angle is set at the neutral position. So if you take yours out of the box and it doesn't have that set that way, I would suggest setting this to neutral, because then you can use these locking screws here. You can undo them, adjust your blade angle to be where you want your starting point to be, and you have the full range of adjustability up and down, because this adjustment here will be centered when you start. So I'm just going to set that up the way that it's supposed to be, and then attach this to the bow, and then we can look at setting up the blade angle. So the way that you actually do the micro adjustment on the angle of the blade is, first of all, this silver set screw on the side. You need to loosen this set screw just a little bit, and then by turning this bolt, you'll be able to move the blade angle up and down. So let's try and do that now. So as you can see now, here in this little window, we can see half metal, half spring, which means that our micro adjustment is centered nicely. The problem though now is that the blade angle is crazy high. But the way that we're going to fix that is by loosening this screw here and here. And that actually loosens this whole metal bar up so that it can slide into and out of the body, and you can change the angle of the blade as well. So I'll show you guys that real quick. So we grab that, undo that screw, and now this whole thing you can set wherever you want. Even take it all the way out if you need to. So now we can mount this to the bow and basically then try and make sure that this lines up with the arrow and is at the right angle and all that stuff. So let's do that. So we've got the rest mounted to the bow, and now you may be wondering, well, how do I know what angle to set my blade at? And I've been doing a little bit of reading online about the theories behind that. And from what I can tell, a good starting point is about 30 degrees. Now, if you're wondering, well, how do I know what 30 degrees is? If you don't have a protractor, you can always draw yourself a little triangle that's 1.75 inches along one face and 1 inch along the other face. And when you intersect those, the angle on this side here is 30 degrees. So for everyone who's metric like myself, that's a 42 millimeter line and a 23 millimeter vertical line will give you 30 degrees on this corner here. Now you might be wondering what all the books on the table are for, and basically the reason why they're here is because before I took the rest off, I placed these books at the same height that when my arrow is knocked on the string, it actually intersected with the V in the previous rest perfectly, which means that that's approximately where my center shot needs to be. So again, I'll stress the point that this is just a rough setup to get me in the right spot really quickly, and then I will actually go out, fine-tune everything to make sure that the arrow is shooting perfectly out of the bow. So now what I need to do is loosen those two screws again so I can move this arm in a bit so that the V in the blade actually lines up with the arrow shaft perfectly. So I cut the little triangle out, and basically I can slide it in here and check my angle. So from what I can see, I need to make the angle a little less steep, but in order to do that I need to move the whole rest assembly down just a little bit. So the way that we adjust elevation on the rest is actually with this screw on the bottom here. So hopefully you can see what I'm pointing at. So looking at the marks on the side here, it is perfectly neutral. I need to move it down just a tiny bit. So we'll grab the right size Allen key first. Now, one of the cool things about the edge swap is it doesn't actually have a lockdown feature, which means that at any point in time you can make adjustments, but it's tight enough that it's not going to move once you have made your adjustments and you're happy with where everything's sitting. So you can see there I've made a tiny little adjustment. We'll get this back on the table like we had it before. Grab the arrow, put it in here. Make sure it's just touching the blade, which it is. Alright, so I made all the adjustments that I needed, and as you can see now, when I put my little 30-degree template in here, it lines up with the blade and the arrow perfectly. So I'm pretty happy with where that's sitting at the moment. I'm going to take the arrow off, make sure that all the bolts that need to be tightened up are tightened up, and then have another look at the bow in my hand to see where my arrow is sitting in relation to everything else. So there we go, that's pretty much what I thought might work in order to get this thing installed and close to where it should be. Now, like I've said several times in the video, I am planning on actually getting out there and micro tuning this thing. So when I do make it to the club, I'm going to be putting it on the bow vise, getting the levels out, making sure everything is actually where it's supposed to be. It's going to be pretty interesting to see how close I may have gotten using this unorthodox method of installing a rest, but for all intents and purposes it seems to be pretty close. I mean, I grab the arrow, whack it in the bow, and that's looking pretty good in my opinion. It looks a little point low, but I'll go over something with you guys in a second as far as that's concerned. And then I don't know if the camera's going to show this up, but keeping the string in the middle of the bow, the arrow is actually seems to be perfectly centered through the string as well, which is pretty much what you want when you've got your arrow spined correctly and you're using a center shot bow, which pretty much any compound is a center shot bow, as I'm sure you guys already know. Now, I've been reading a lot about blade setups when it comes to your compound bows, and I read something that to me made a lot of sense, which is why I'm not too fussed that my arrow is actually point low while it's sitting on the rest here. And the theory is, and this may be common knowledge to everyone, I've never professed to be any sort of expert when it comes to these things, but it just made a lot of sense to me. The theory is that your blade rest is not designed to actually support the weight of the arrow and keep the arrow at 90 degrees to the string. The blade rest is designed so that it stops or reduces the amount of flex and vibration that you get in your arrow when it leaves the bow. So it sort of tames the flex of the arrow as it leaves the bow, if that makes sense. I'm still trying to wrap my head around it a little bit as well. So if you have your own thoughts and views on this, leave them in the comments below so that we can all maybe learn something out of this as well. So the idea is that your vanes are going to provide lift to your arrow. Now, this isn't my idea, this is just what I've read online. So if you don't agree, don't flame me. I'm just trying some new things to see whether or not there's any substance to them. If you do agree, let me know because I'm interested. So the idea is that because the arrow is point low at rest, this is the whole 30-degree thing with a .010 blade, as you draw back, less weight, because let's face it, at the moment the majority of the weight that's resting on the blade is the part of the arrow that's hanging over the farthest. So this whole piece here is pretty heavy. But as you draw the bow back, you're reducing the amount of weight that's actually in front of the rest, which will allow the rest to then start flexing up a little bit more, because it's got less weight sitting on it, because the knock point at the back of the arrow is taking up the rest of the weight of the arrow. So when you're at full draw, basically what happens then is, because the majority of the weight's being held by the string and not the actual blade anymore, the blade will lift up slightly because it doesn't have as much weight sitting on it, which will bring your arrow into 90 degrees to the string. Now, I imagine it's going to be a case of a little bit of trial and error to get that blade angle perfect for the thickness of the blade that you're using, so that when you get to full draw, everything's sitting level and at 90 degrees. It makes sense to me. What do you guys think? I suppose what we could do is put this on my draw board and test that theory. It's pretty miserable weather outside, so I might see if I can bring the draw board in here and have a quick look and see whether or not that's actually what's happening. So bear with me while I set that up. Alright, so I'm not sure how well this is going to show up on the camera, but let's have a look at it anyway. Got to try and get the bow somewhat level. And hopefully what that's showing as the bow comes to full draw is that the blade has actually lifted up a bit. So I'll grab the camera and I'll move it backwards to give you a better view of the whole setup. And hopefully what you can see here is that the arrow does appear to be perfectly level in the bow. So if nothing else, at least that gives you an idea of what's actually going on with the blade when the arrow moves back. So, but like I said, this is all just experimenting at the moment, and we'll see when I shoot it through paper and all that stuff, just how accurate I managed to get it. So hopefully that illustrated what it was that I was referring to as the blade lifts up slightly when you get to full draw, because there's not as much weight sitting on the blade itself. I do have an example of an arrow that was shot out of this bow when I wasn't really all that cluey about setting up these blade rests, and don't get me wrong, by no means do I profess to be any sort of expert at this stage. I'm still learning. The only reason I keep putting these things up is so that hopefully we can all learn together. So anyway, indoor arrow, Easton X23. I thought to myself, heavy arrow, it was sagging the blade too much in my mind, and as a result I put on a heavier blade. What I noticed straight away was that the arrow was coming out of the bow knock high, and I wasn't quite sure why. So looking at the setup that I had, when this was in the bow and the bow was at brace, the arrow was sitting level, 90 degrees to the string, everything that you taught when you learn how to set up a drop away rest. So that's what led me to doing some reading online, and basically where I figured out what it was that I was doing wrong. So if you have a look at this arrow here, see the two lines in the wrap? Those are from the prongs on the blade because the blade was too stiff. So the arrow wasn't actually getting away from the blade as it left the bow. It was riding the blade all the way down, and that's definitely not what you want. The blade rest is really just a shock absorber. It's a leaf spring like in a car, and a leaf spring in a car is designed to absorb shock when you drive over bumps and things like that. So the leaf spring or the blade in your blade rest, again, it makes sense that it's designed basically to try and dampen the shock of the arrow leaving the bow, not guide the arrow out of the bow. So makes sense to me. I won't really know until I actually shoot this to see how it goes. So I'm pretty much going to leave this video there. It's starting to get a little bit long. Next step for me with a bow is basically shooting it to see how it goes, and then fine-tuning the rest to get it to where it needs to be. Now, it's raining outside. I don't really have the room to shoot inside as far as tuning and things like that is concerned, so it's going to have to wait for another day. So that's it for today. Thanks for watching the video. If you have any views on what it is that we've covered in this video, please leave a comment down below. Whether you agree with what was said or whether you have opposing views, it doesn't matter, as long as we all end up learning something together. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so. Click the little bell icon so that you can receive a notification each time I upload a new video. I hope you all have a great week, and remember, just do good shots. So there's a bit of a break in the weather, and I thought I couldn't show you guys that whole setup process where we're sort of hoping that it's going to work without actually shooting a couple of arrows as is. Now, I haven't made any adjustments to the bow since what you saw earlier in the video. I got 4 arrows in my pocket, and we're going to shoot them and see how we go. Now, you know, it is a little bit windy today, you can see that. I'm trying to beat the weather, which is why I'm trying to be a bit quick, but let's shoot these arrows and see how they end up in the target. Using the stand element, of course. Sounds a little different to the rest I had on here before. Got that very metallic sort of swing noise. Shoot another arrow, see where that ends up. I haven't even made an adjustment to the sight for this rest yet either, so it's still set up for the rest I had on here before. I really shouldn't notice much of a difference in arrow speed, so I imagine the sight markings will still be the same. Let's go and have a look. So it's been interesting trying to set the rest up without using all of the proper tools and everything. And let's have a look and see how we did. So a 10, a 10, well, an X and 2 9s. Now, it's a little inconsistent, so it's hard to say, but it's not a bad group for 18 meters. with no actual proper setup. So it seems to have done the job. Like I said many times already, I am going to do the micro tuning and make sure that everything's perfect, but for a quick and dirty, chuck it on and get it close enough that you can actually shoot reasonable arrows, it seems to have worked pretty well.